Welcome to this evening's Sonnabend Fellow Public Lecture. My name is Catherine Coverola, and I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Social Sciences here at Lesley University, and it's my pleasure to welcome each one of you here. The purpose of the Sonnabend Fellowship is to bring to campus each year a distinguished practitioner or scholar in the field of human services and higher education to work with Lesley students, faculty to enrich our academic community. And this fellowship was established in 1989 through the generosity of the Sonnabend family in honor of their mother, Elsa Sonnabend, who is or was one of the former chairs of the Board of Trustees, and she was an active and dedicated member of the board for over 20 years. Elsa Sonnabend was truly a remarkable woman ahead of her time, and she has raised amazing daughters, two of whom are here today, Stephanie and Jackie. And Stephanie was just honored earlier this month as one of Boston's most influential women. She's here today with her husband, Gregory. And we also have two other Sonnabend family members here, Nancy and her daughter, Patty. So we especially welcome the Sonnabend family. The Sonnabend Fellowship has had many distinguished Sonnabend Fellows. A few of the people who precede our Sonnabend Fellow today are Paul Farmer, David Gear, Dan Siegel, and last year, John Kabat-Zinn. This year's Sonnabend Fellow is Diana Chapman Walsh. And Diana is truly a distinguished scholar and leader in higher education. She currently serves on the governing boards of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Broad Institute, the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and she's also on the board of the Mind and Life Institute, as well as on many national advisory boards. She's been a director of the State Street Corporation, and she's a trustee emerita of Amherst College, having served on their board for a number of years. She is also president emeritus of Wellesley College, where she led transformative change, which enriched the vibrancy and life of that truly remarkable institution. And it's been my pleasure to become acquainted with Diana in preparation for this event tonight. And Diana is absolutely one of the most remarkable and distinguished leaders in higher education today. And she's made countless contributions. I've only cited a few areas where she's served. Her life has touched many, and many of you are here today whose lives she has touched. This past summer, she was the person who facilitated all of the dialogues that happened in Dharamsala, India, with the Dalai Lama and his students and scholars, as well as researchers and scholars from throughout the world. I had the pleasure of hearing her tell some of the most delightful and amazing stories of what she experienced just this summer when she was in India, bridging Buddhist scholars with researchers from around the world. But what I found truly the most wonderful about Diana is who she is as a woman, as a human being. She's so honest. She's filled with humility. She has a hilarious sense of humor, and she's really a human. And in a very short time, I have just grown so fond of her and love her. She embraces all the roles that are upon a woman, as a wife, as a mother, as a grandma. She has shown me delightful pictures of her grandson, who's adorable. Her role as a daughter, as a colleague, as a mentor, and a friend. And that, for me, is what's the most special about welcoming her to this podium, that a person who is so alive as a human being, as a person, has so much to teach us about leadership and about mindfulness. And so join me in welcoming Diana Chapman Walsh.
Wow, thank you so much, Catherine, for that introduction. One always starts getting a little nervous about whether you'll live up to it. But I really appreciate it, and I too have just loved the chance to get to know you. It's such an honor to be here. I'm really happy to be here. I want to first thank the Sonnabend family. I said to you at dinner, I'm very honored to carry your name for a day as your fellow, and it's a wonderful privilege, and I know your mother, Elsa Sonnabend, was so important to Lesley, and it was fun to learn more about her, so thanks for that. And it's a privilege to be part of a program that helps keep her memory alive. And thanks to the whole Lesley University community. I've admired you from afar and been kind of intrigued by now what is this place and what's it all about for a long time, even before you declared yourselves a university. And I thought, gee, maybe Wellesley should be a university. I don't know. But the interesting process of kind of getting ready to be with you today and then being with you at dinner and I missed part of the day. We're going to try to recreate that later on. All of that has just enhanced my appreciation for who you are, and what you do. So I'm just delighted that I got this chance to delve a little more deeply into Lesley. I sat down to write this talk on the morning of Patriots Day. It was time for me to start thinking about it. And I began by exploring your website, and I was reading your strategic plan. I read most of it and struck by your emphasis on student engagement and learning and diversity and alternative perspectives and, quote, meaningful shared governance and collegial leadership at all levels. That really resonated with me. And then this piece of your mission statement, scholarship grounded in practice, learning rooted in experience, that combination. Graduates who you hope will leave with, quote, the knowledge, skill, understanding, and ethical judgment to be catalysts who shape a more just, humane, and sustainable world. Those are stirring words. A few weeks earlier, I'd had this wonderful lunch that Catherine and I had that she referred to. And as we were wrapping up our conversation, she was kind of giving me the scoop on Lesley and some guidance to think about what I might bring that might be useful to you. She said, we were just getting ready to get up from the lunch table, and she said in a kind of coda that seemed to bubble up unbidden from her, Lesley University people, the faculty, the students, the staff, are beautiful human beings. Their commitment to social justice and activism is a bright thread that runs through the whole community. So I was remembering that characterization and seeing it in your self-presentation on the web as I was exploring that, when I started hearing sirens all around me. I live in Brookline. So I turned on the radio. So that moment of utter disbelief that anyone would have bombed our beloved marathon, a joyful civic celebration that honors the city's origins and defines in many ways our values, will be forever merged in my mind with my sense of who you are. And you are, it seems to me, if I got it right, all of this wallowing around, are helpers and teachers, your kindred spirits, I think, with those who metaphorically and sometimes quite physically rush into the face of chaos as others are rushing out. So with that in mind, I want to dedicate this talk to the helpers, the first responders and the continuing responders, the ones who stay with it, who bring us back to the best of humankind. Around the world, whenever we are shaken by one of these acts of brutality and insanity and terror, we see emerge at the same time and in larger measure acts of kindness and courage, of resilience and resolve. That Governor Patrick said it the day after the attacks. He said, lots and lots of people are lifting each other up. Doing that and telling our stories is how we heal. Telling our stories. So the stories of compassion and bravery and love are the light that drives out the shadow of fear and rage and incomprehension. In the end, they are really all we have of meaningfulness in the face of evil. And they're all we need. So I find myself stirred tonight to speak to you in part about compassion and love. Now, those are soft subjects some of us might mutter to ourselves for an academic gathering. And as I think about that hard-soft tension, I wonder about a question that you may be living here at Lesley now with your dedication to intellectual rigor, and that's very strongly emphasized in these materials I found on the web, side by side with this growing interest in contemplative practice and mindfulness as a subject of serious study. So the question, my question, maybe yours, is how best in the academy to reconcile the demands of head and heart. And I'll answer it, or try to, with my own story, in hopes that part of it may amplify parts of yours. I'll begin with the story of how I was drawn toward mindfulness and contemplative study. I didn't start out there, and that brings me to the title of tonight's talk. A very wise person at Lesley, whom we've been hearing from, Beth Chambers, wrote to me after I emailed her my first cut at a title. She needed a title to start doing the publicity. This was quite a long time ago, and I sent to her, "Gentle Emissaries from a World of Possibility." I thought that sounded poetic. And I got this email back from Beth. It was a very gentle email. She said, "Would you mind terribly if we were to add a subtitle that would just be a little more specific?" And so that's where we got the subtitle from Beth, "The Convergence of Leadership and Mindfulness." And it was a very useful corrective. I bow to you, Beth. So for me, the discovery of mindfulness was initially very much implicated in the practice of leadership. Leadership that's effective or trustworthy, as I've written. I came of age as a leader in higher education, a setting where there is an inherent distrust of authority and of people who might think they're in charge. Faculty, and I used to be one, and I confess that I kind of cherish this identity too. Faculty are independent, necessarily, and sometimes defiantly so. Suspicious of administrators, always on the lookout for the hidden agenda. I'm sure that's not true here, right, Joe? You never. Students emulate faculty. Skepticism reigns. Trustworthy leadership, I discovered in this frothy cauldron, begins and ends with leaders who can question themselves. Gradually, I discovered that the contemplative disciplines could help me do that questioning, help me stabilize my mind, engage in deeper reflection, quiet my heart, manage my stress, see my blind spots, and ground in a truth that I could trust, a truth based not solely on my ability to integrate knowledge, but equally in my skillfulness at integrating myself as knower, mind, body, heart, and spirit. If I couldn't trust myself, I realized, how could I expect anyone else to trust me? And how could I trust myself if I couldn't bring my several parts together into some semblance of a unified field, summon into something like a committee of the whole, the pesky inner voices that were being tripped by pressures that were coming at me from every turn? Surprising answers to those questions began to find me in the form of people I came to view as gentle emissaries from the contemplative traditions. That's the title, in case you missed it. Every now and then, often unannounced, another of these visitors would appear and extend me a fresh invitation to slow down and pay attention. Attention is a form of love, as we know, perhaps its ultimate expression. And these loving encounters changed me in subtle but signal ways. They involved, among others, Arun Gandhi, the Mahatma's grandson, who spent a week on our campus as we hosted an international conference commemorating his grandfather's 125th birth anniversary in 1994. That was my second year on the job. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, whom I met for the first time in 1997 as a fellow faculty member at a conference at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. Maha Ghosananda, a Cambodian Buddhist leader who appeared twice, quite literally, on my doorstep at the president's house on a Friday and the following Sunday in 1998 and sat with me on the terrace of the president's house overlooking the lake for several hours in playful and easy silences punctuated by quirky lessons he offered me in his few words of English as he emptied his pockets. He had this funny little vest on over his saffron robe. He was pulling things out of his pockets and laughing at himself for failing to travel light. A small group of Tibetan monks who made us a sand mandala in a tent outside our chapel in 2001 at a conference we hosted on education as transformation. And a few years later, a larger group of Tibetan nuns trained in the same tradition who spent a full week on our campus in our art museum, enthralling large crowds who were coming from all over the greater Boston area with the beauty of their creation, the sand mandala they were making, and the power of their message about devotion and attention and impermanence. At the end of the week, they swept it up into these pieces of cloth and chanted and marched over to a bridge crossing a stream going into our lake and just threw it in the lake. And that was the end of this amazingly beautiful creation. And a sweet and touching day on our campus with Thich Nhat Hanh, as he led a retreat for several hundred of his followers, including mindful walking all over the campus, and closed it by painting a calligraphy, big brushstrokes, and presenting it to me with a flourish. "The kingdom is now or never," it said in bold black ink. I don't know what that meant, but maybe I do. I had it framed and I hung it in a prominent spot in my office, in the president's office, and it remained there until I left the presidency about 6 years ago. And I'd often notice people glancing at it, kind of sidelong and wondering, but not one person ever ventured a word about it. Not even a question. And I took this as silent evidence of their discomfort in seeing it there, and maybe their bemusement. Living in its presence, though, became a kind of anchor for me. It was quiet testimony to my evolving consciousness of the subversive power of contemplative practice in higher education. So perhaps it was in part these visitations from the East, completely unexpected and unplanned from my perspective, that guided me to the teaching that ignorance lies at the root of suffering, and to see my evolving contemplative practice not as a religious or spiritual gesture or identity, but as a doorway to learning. I was learning a new way of being in the world, of cultivating a mindful and ethical integrity, of coming to know the force fields I inhabited and the tricks that my mind could play, the traps that it could lay. And I want to pause for a minute and just underscore the importance of this distinction I've just made. For us, important for our students. The secularization of the contemplative practices and their gradual grounding in scientific research have moved them out of the realm of religion and unquestioning faith, which of course is of concern, and rightly so, to faculty, received wisdom, and into the realm of education, open for investigation and critique. This turn, interestingly, was adumbrated more than a century ago by the great psychologist William James, long before we all became prisoners of our machines, perpetually wired and chronically distracted. He wrote this: "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again," this was in Principles of Psychology in 1890, "that faculty is the very root of judgment, character, and will, and education which should improve this faculty will be the education par excellence." That's William James. So the simple being there aspect of mindfulness is one of its great assets in the academy. Its cultivation of qualities of concentration, reflection, self-observation, compassion, deeper engagement with the material, all skills requiring nothing in the way of belief. Skills. Just building sound judgment and character and will in James's terms, or in ours, emotional regulation and sustained attention. We have mounting scientific evidence of the importance of these skills for success in school and in life. In addition, I was discovering back then, and this was essential to me, that the practice carried me not down into solipsistic self-absorption, but up and out into an awareness of my impact on others, and to greater clarity about what it was that I did or didn't have to give in any situation. It alerted me to opportunities for connection and community, nourished my gratitude, opened me to delight, and helped me bring my best self into the day's encounters. Much more than a personal path, then the practice of stopping to orient in the moment enabled me to live into and embody the role of the president with fuller integrity in those early years. It was a key both to my success and to my freedom to enjoy the role in ways that I hadn't been able to before because I was working so hard at it. These experiences, these emissaries, seemed to be seeking me more than I was seeking them. And in part as a result of them, I began to develop a reputation I hadn't sought as a president of a high-profile institution who'd gone out on what was perceived by some as a dangerous limb. I became more and more public in pursuit of the questions of whether, and more fully how, an excellent liberal education, a truly integrative education, might join body, mind, and spirit for a whole human being seeking knowledge in all its complexity and all its mystery. I was out on a limb. Words like that from a president. And it was out there that I began to encounter the friends and colleagues who would encourage me on. John Kabat-Zinn, your Sonnabend speaker last year, was one of them. Initially in disembodied form through his writings and tapes. For many years, he was my meditation teacher, the mainstay who laid the foundations for me and inspired me to delve deeper and venture farther along that path. When I met John, the fully embodied version, we became friends as we participated in an informal discussion group with Otto Scharmer and Peter Senge and a few others. So we, John and these others and I, were meeting at the president's house and trying to envision an entirely different kind of university. A very humble, you said I was humble, a very humble project. Another person in this little circle was Arthur Zients, the Amherst physicist who was the co-convener of that little group in my living room, and as he has been of many such groups, including the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society and the professional society that they spun out, the ACMHE, which is the Association of Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. That one's a mouthful. And now Arthur is president of the Mind and Life Institute. He's the one who persuaded me to join the board a year ago. But it was my early interactions with Arthur in my living room that I discovered his groundbreaking work over many years, articulating, reshaping, and refining the intellectual antecedents and arguments for a radical vision of education as transformation, this idea. That was around the turn of the millennium, and we were watching the twin forces of globalization and technology tying humanity at a breakneck speed into more and more complex networks of mutual dependency. And yet, as Peter Senge was saying to us, we humans have only just begun to evolve the social sophistication we need in order to live interdependently. This has come on us very fast, and we really don't know how to handle it. He calls it the greatest learning challenge human beings have ever faced. Surely then it raises questions about how we educate our young. We concluded that all around the world we lack and sorely need leaders who can meet crisis situations with approaches that are systemic in their understanding, interinstitutional in their structure, innovative in their strategies, and inclusive of all the relevant stakeholders, visible and invisible, including the poor and the disenfranchised, at the edges of life, children, and the 7 generations that the Native Americans bore in mind. And so I'm here to suggest that as you continue to deliver with vigor and rigor the intellectually rich education for which you're known, there's also ample space for this other context on which you have such a keen eye trained. Our culture urgently needs in all sectors, including those for which you're preparing your graduates. This thing is a little reactive. Next generation leaders who will be equal to today's challenges in all their complexity and who will be skillful in leading themselves with compassion and equanimity. What if the way ahead for a safer, saner future is leaders who are gifted in the ways of community, connection, contemplation? Can we grow up leaders who skillfully lead themselves, who understand that they have a special responsibility to manage their own inner shadows, their own inner demons, lest they cast more shadow than light on those around them. Ah, the rejoinder comes. These are times for muscular leadership. We are told to be afraid, be very, very afraid, and to place our trust in heroic deciders offering simple comforts. But surely these nervous times call for Einstein's new levels of thinking, the more urgently if we believe we're entering or are in a period of profound change, as I think we would agree. What kinds of people do we want leading our vital institutions through historic transformations? How do we want them to lead? What should we expect of leaders we can trust? These were some of the deepest questions I was living in those 14 years that I was leading Wellesley and living in that beautiful president's house. Accepting the presidency had been a fairly blind leap for me, and I faced a steep learning curve when I first took up the job. The initial years were daunting, to say the least, as I fashioned myself into an entirely different person than I'd ever been and learned about a whole range of practical issues I'd never thought much about. But by far the most disconcerting adjustment in those early days was an emotional one, as I learned to stand in a force field of projections coming from every direction. People were constantly sending me signals about what I would have to do to win their approval. They would love me one minute, then hate me the next, all the while imagining me as the leader they unconsciously needed me to be. Sometimes hero, sometimes goat. Sound familiar? We do that to our leaders. It took discipline and conscious effort to learn to guard my spirit against the dehumanizing effects of this echo chamber of projections, to find solid ground on which I could stand apart from the expectations of others without losing my connections to them. Too often, when pressed beyond their comfort zones, as most are at some point, leaders fall into one of two traps. They let their egos get hooked, and soon they're sucking all the air out of the room. Or they flee from the criticism and build walls around themselves. I knew I didn't want to lead in either of those lonely ways, and so I knew I needed to work on myself instead. Over time and with help, I evolved a distinctive style of self-conscious leadership rooted in a network of resilient partnerships. The challenges that brought me to my knees at the outset originated more often than not, and I think this will resonate with you too, as disagreements over differences. I know you've thought a lot about that here. The pattern was established in the first months of my presidency with a big test and a very public battle between two senior professors, a Jewish woman, a classicist, and a black man, an Afrocentrist, who became caricatures of themselves as they took one another on in escalating cycles of contempt and calumny. That struggle occasioned coverage in the New York Times and a one-sentence note from the president of a Quaker college, a school rooted in pacifism, that just said, "Welcome to the culture wars." Though never again on that scale, the test continued through my 14 years in the typical parade of campus skirmishes, student-led uprisings over identity and power, conflicts within academic departments playing out ancient grudges or reacting to shifting alliances, eruptions on the electronic conferences, sticky judicial cases, unpopular tenure decisions, controversial hires, provocative speakers, and many not-so-subtle bids for institutional resources and recognition, inflected more often than not with identity claims of one kind or another. Always challenging. Comes with the territory. At the same time, and this is important, I loved being president of Wellesley College. It was the privilege of a lifetime in every respect, and in most respects, it was a joy. And this tough and confusing arena, this engaging of our differences with which my tenure started with such a bang, was oddly enough among the richest and most fertile fields we had for deep and sustained learning. Mine and that of my administrative team, the faculty, the alumni, the trustees, and especially the students. I can't count the number of times a student would circle back to me with a new take on a particularly painful eruption. There might have been tears in my office, protests in the halls outside, angry email exchanges, temper tantrums, the whole mishigas. But then later, one or another participant would reemerge through a note or an email message at my president's open office hours, at a 5-year reunion, occasionally in a more public way, in a speech or a writing. She would find a way to let me know how much the incident had taught her, how grateful she was for that lesson, how hard won though it was. So the students taught me early that the way to survive the culture wars would be to convert them into learning experiences, to push them deeper than they might otherwise have taken us without a nudge from the president, a nudge intending to open a new opportunity for individual and institutional growth. And the trick I learned was to view difference as inevitable and healthy, not something to be managed or suppressed. The impulse is so strong to manage it, to tamp it down, to suppress it. Instead, to hold and honor and amplify the differences within the community as a necessary step towards forging bonds of unity. This meant admitting that no college, and indeed no institution, will ever be a utopia, free of ignorance and incivility and disagreement. When we tried to smooth all the rough edges, we would find that we had muted or marginalized dissent and driven it underground. We came to see conflict as a necessary generative force and differences of opinion and experience, polar positions and contradictions as a critical part of any learning process. Learning involves first mastering new categories and then integrating them into a larger and more organic whole. The differentiation stage requires heightening and sharpening the differences intellectually and experientially, widening the gap between the two opposing poles, really seeing and feeling what's different here, walking all the way into a charged or hostile field, absorbing its energy. The integration stage becomes possible when finally you're able to find a new position, a new place to stand that incorporates the two conflicting realities in a third, more complex and more comprehensive whole. That's really the essence of the creative process, if we think about it. But while we needed our differences heightened and amplified, not muted or papered over, we also discovered how important it was to avoid over-personalizing those differences, converting them from divergences of viewpoint, fact, or interpretation to personal attacks, affronts, and wounds, or triggers to that most corrosive of emotions, humiliation. When conflict becomes personal, it deepens resentment or threatens a relationship and shifts the focus from the intellectual work of understanding and learning about a substantive difference to the emotional work of mending or compensating for a damaged relationship or hunkering down in anticipation of retaliation. When we were able to discover and address the true and legitimate needs expressed by voices at the margins, needs that actually are seldom reflected accurately in the symbolic or emotional demands that tend to surface at first, then we could find ways to improve the situation for everyone. Those voices at the margin were speaking for the whole. So the task was to design encounters where we could penetrate through the presenting symptoms to something more real, more vital. These kinds of deep encounters require a willingness to be changed, to engage others fully, expecting to absorb aspects of their otherness openly, respectfully, empathically, being prepared to let the other's testimony shake your unexamined assumptions. And so the demands of leading in this way require inner work as a necessary complement to the management of external events. I came to understand the inner work of leadership as indispensable, the work of paying close attention to how I was leading myself. It was one thing to articulate a set of values about how I wanted to lead, quite another to embody them and to do so consistently and under stress. I was lucky to assemble an amazing team of colleagues, vice presidents and deans like your cabinet, Joe, wonderful people, and trustees and staff. And with their assistance and that of an organizational consultant we worked with, we evolved a network of sturdy partnerships through which I led the college, titrating in each one of those partnerships and in the collective of all of them, the web of all of them, a blend of self-responsibility and interdependence. Two values that I wanted to be certain we were offering our students, self-responsibility and interdependence. This is important too. The aspirations I had for my leadership team were aligned with those we had for our students. were in fact the motive force behind the philosophy of leadership we were trying to embody in our work and to model on the campus. First and foremost, we wanted it known all of us were there to learn. And so we learned together. I learned, my partners learned, the college learned, and the learning was the point. With time, intention, concentration, mindfulness, when we allow our minds to drop down into our hearts as we can do when we're still and silent, we do learn to change ourselves. And when we change ourselves, things begin to shift. Our learning at Wellesley began in self-questioning and in an appreciation of the relational, ecological, and interdependent nature of the world. We learned to take seriously the assertion that knowledge is provisional and that knowing a communal reality requires engaging it directly and seeing it whole, or trying to, all its many parts. We drew on systems theory and complexity science, looking for connections and for the deeper structures that repeatedly produce results that no one wants. And from that followed the imperative of listening to many voices, assembling different perspectives, fostering collaborative efforts to build more compelling narratives, both of our current reality and of a preferable future many could want. We learned to reflect regularly on our own motivations and self-delusions, while at the same time working with others to read the force fields in this larger system. That enabled us over time to break down boundaries, forge new relationships of mutuality and trust, unleash the generative power of multiple mental models, and create new realities. What we learned about how to work with difference was contrary to conventional notions about how to drive deep systemic change in an organization. The commonplace idea is that change processes require altering structures, issuing directives, developing strategic plans and systems of accountability. That real change, that transformational change, is big, top-down change. All of that is necessary, of course, but our experience was that the hardest work of transformational change was the quietest part. The inner and interpersonal dialogues through which we gradually reconsidered our habitual ways of thinking. We saw the inside shift precede the outside one, or dance with it over time, as individuals and small groups began to shift their mental models about how the world works to re-examine their taken-for-granted assumptions about the rules of the game. I learned that my power, the power of the presidency, existed for the essential purpose of enabling others to find their purpose, their authority, their self-authorship. And I learned that to achieve that, I would have to remain open to others in a way that is the essence of love. Love conceived as the drive to sustain unity and maintain connection, to hold that tension between power and love. I would have to respect the other person's reality, the other person's yearning, the other person's path of growth, to be open to influence back from the others and their different realities. And this in turn taught me the value of diversity as a resource, an indispensable one for a learning community. I learned to hold another tension, and this one was harder still, to honor my inner life in the face of all that was swirling around me. It took time and concerted effort to develop the skills to manage external realities and yet maintain, or try to maintain, a quality of attention in the present that could enfold past and future, embrace complexity, and help me try to meet each new moment with equanimity. I didn't always succeed at this, far from it. But I learned to find my way back when I was lost, and to know this quality of mindful presence as something I wanted for myself, a capacity I wanted for myself and for my leadership team, because I wanted it for our students. It's been said that this new generation escaping into social media as their world spins out of control is being raised on information without context, butter without bread, craving without longing. And yet, we have good evidence, and I'm sure you have good evidence, that new generations are longing for more nourishing fare. The disciplines they will need in the years ahead are the ones we'll all need, and they are a life's work, never fully mastered, always requiring conscious cultivation. We'll need the strength to stare down our demons of fear and despair, so that we can engage the world with curiosity, opening our minds and freeing ourselves of regret, recrimination, and the defeat of shame and blame. we'll need to hear and tolerate the diversity within ourselves, to recognize our own inner voices, identities, moods, to notice how fluid and ephemeral they are, so that we can see and appreciate differences in others, and use the practice of self-discovery to move beyond ourselves. We'll need to move beyond dualities, beyond either or, and then on beyond the simple corrective of both and move to true multiplicities of seeing and of understanding, multiple lenses that acknowledge how competing language games and inequalities of power and control create lived realities that may never even intersect unless we stretch ourselves to bring them together. And this, I think, returns us squarely back to who you are at Lesley. I see you playing an essential role as educators, stimulating deeper dialogues about diversity, working toward a greater capacity to harvest the richness in the differences that divide and yet enrich and inspire us. I see you opening spaces for your students to become increasingly mindful of our immense capacity as humans under the right conditions to find and awaken the best in ourselves and one another. And I see you doing that in part. I see you doing it in everything you do, but I see you doing it also in part by advancing the emerging academic field of mindfulness and contemplative studies. So I want to close with a few words about that field, again in the form of a story. Are we okay for time? And so an important part of this story is also a little minor, gentle correction about some of the facts about my encounter with the Dalai Lama. But here you'll hear minor. In the past year, as a member of this Mind and Life Institute, whose board I joined, I learned much more than I knew in my Wellesley days about the benefits of contemplative practice and their promise for the world. I've had 3 more encounters with the Dalai Lama since that first one in 1997. The most recent was just 3 months ago in the winter, in January, in the Tibetan settlement of Mundgod, South India. So we were not in Dharamsala in this instance. That is where the Tibetan government is, but we were in South India. There I spent a week in a fascinating intellectual exchange that His Holiness had convened for the abbots of the major Tibetan monastic universities and over 5,000 monks and nuns. All of us in attendance were moved by the significance of the event. It was an historic occasion for Tibetan Buddhist education, launching, I love this, the first curricular change in nearly a millennium. And we think our curricula are hard to change. I love this. For more than a decade, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been encouraging, among these abbots and the leaders of these basically universities, encouraging the incorporation of Western science into their curriculum, moving the initiative forward much as any academic leader would, finding champions and early adopters, supporting them, giving them a little money, conferring with experts and bringing the best minds, bringing hotshots from outside to try to convince everybody from far and wide, bringing them into the conversation. And finally, in August, he got the vote he needed to move this thing forward. And our meeting was about launching it. He himself has, for 25 years, been engaging in dialogues with Western science, frequently through Mind and Life, whose board chair, Thumten Jimpa, is his translator, co-author, colleague, and friend. Jimpa has written all the books you see pretty much coming out from the Dalai Lama were written in collaboration with Jimpa, and he is the one who's sitting next to His Holiness whenever His Holiness is in an English-speaking country. Jimpa is there in a mind meld. So it was natural that the Dalai Lama would turn to Mind and Life for help with this important event. He'd been instrumental in founding this organization, Mind and Life, to bridge the gap between 2 great intellectual traditions, believing that the 2 together would far surpass either one alone in the search for a full understanding of the human mind. So the first-person phenomenological perspective of the world's contemplative traditions with their 2 millennia of serious scholarship, and the third-person objectivist perspective of Western science with its increasingly powerful methodologies and tools for probing the mind. Over a quarter of a century, that partnership has moved through many phases of dialogue and recently well beyond just dialogue. These encounters between East and West have helped to catalyze a growing body of original research on the effects of mindfulness, the beginnings of an entirely new discipline, contemplative neuroscience, and many interdisciplinary connections, new research paradigms, new fellowships, new professional organizations, summer research institutions, international forums, and a nascent but active and fertile and growing field. And I know many Lesley faculty have been tracking these developments and participating in them. And from what I saw in South Asia, I think that's really an exciting direction for you to be exploring. Because what I saw in Mungad was a very different educational system, embracing the future. A system deeply rooted in its own powerful traditions going back some 2,500 years. Tibetan Buddhist monks retreat to focus full-time on seeking enlightenment, which they understand as a complete understanding of the world. They are, quote, mind scientists. Columbia University scholar Robert Thurman, who's worked with them for his whole career, has written. And in that sense, they're more like modern scientists retreating into a lab. I'm married to one of those guys. Than ascetic spiritual seekers escaping the world. They are scholars carrying on the living tradition of the great monastic centers of learning that were established in India in the first millennium of the Common Era. These were intellectual hubs, realms of study, sites of robust debate on highly sophisticated texts in Sanskrit, a sophisticated language, and philosophical traditions, as well as places of prayer and meditation. It was all a unified whole. We observed all of this going on around us during our visit, and it was thrilling. My most enduring impression was that Tibetan monastic education comprises, first and foremost, intense intellectual work. During our dialogue sessions, every day, pretty much all day, the Dalai Lama was communicating by example to his community, showing them a path that he's found, just as the Buddha instructed his followers not to take what he said on faith, but to find the truth for themselves through the path that he was offering. At one point, the Dalai Lama spoke movingly of what it was like as a young leader of his people to flee his homeland and to suddenly emerge in a much larger world, to look about and say, oh my gosh, there's a big wide world I know nothing about, and to feel acutely the responsibility as a teacher and a leader to learn more about that world. And this is a moment of truth familiar to any of us who teach or have taught. Oh my gosh, there's more out there my students need me to know. In his exchange with the team of scholars that we brought to the meeting, the Dalai Lama was demonstrated for the assembled monastics of every age, and they were, from very young to quite advanced in age, that they can open themselves to the other. The new materialists, he called us with a chuckle. He laughs a lot. These are the new materialists. They had a war with the materialists in India back before the Common Era. That they could open themselves to us and these scholars we brought from all over the world, expecting and preparing to be transformed by that encounter, and yet confident at the same time that it wouldn't annihilate them or extinguish what distinguishes them or diminish it. The gift that they have to offer, that it would not diminish that. And he was making manifest his own experience that their understanding of what they bring can be sharpened and deepened rather than diluted or diminished in the encounter if they enter it in a spirit of open, warm-hearted inquiry. He loved those words. He talked about how, when he first started having these discussions with these Nobel laureate scientists, and they'd come and he thought, he was the supplicant needing to be taught, but these scientists were really intrigued by what he had to say, and the more they kind of leaned into each other in these dialogues, he realized we have something equally important, equally fascinating to offer these modern scientists. So it was quite an experience to watch this extraordinary leader bringing his people across a deep and menacing chasm, transforming Tibetan monastic education to embrace selected aspects of modernity, its advances and its promises, but with them, its anxieties and distortions. And at the same time, he was also offering the West a hand to help us cross our deep divide, to pull us back from our overheated materialism and the grasping that's causing great suffering to us and to others around the world, and we all know it. Implicit, of course, throughout the week as we probe different conceptions of the nature of reality, the science of mind, the roots of consciousness, and the application of contemplative practice to problems in the modern world. That was the content of these dialogues. But on the fifth day, as we were breaking for lunch, so the next to last day, he reached for his microphone, he put it on his head, his little microphone, and he rocked gently. He always sits, of course, cross-legged on this chair. He rocked gently from side to side. And he commented on how comfortable we were compared to most of the world's 7 billion people. And he spoke of his dream of an educational initiative that would somehow sweep across the world, that would teach what he calls secular ethics as a means of reducing human suffering and promoting human flourishing. I was moderating at that time. I didn't moderate the whole thing, but I was moderating then, and he was speaking to me. And so it felt through me to the Mind and Life Institute and on to the larger educational community in this country and around the world. And so I'm here to pass the charge along to you. We are standing at a crossroads now as we face a future in which material progress has presented humans with these daunting challenges that we know all too well. At the same time, though, advances in science, together with growing respect for the historic wisdom, practices, and traditions, are opening new possibilities for interdevelopment as a complement and also an antidote to the decades of our preoccupation with outer material growth and progress. Can we begin to transform the process of education to one that nourishes students' cooperative, connective, altruistic capacities, that teaches them to be more fully human? And aren't these, in the end, essential qualities of the graduates you envision in your mission statement and the graduates you'll be celebrating in a week or so? The, quote, catalysts who will shape a more just, humane, and sustainable world. So I commend you, I cheer you on, and wish you every success in your so important work. And I thank you very much for having me here and hearing me out. So it was embedded in a longer context, but the idea that, yeah, I mean, so we certainly, there is not, I'm not talking about deconstructionism, I don't mean to be, but there are multiple perspectives that can be brought to bear, and our knowledge, what we think to be our final knowledge of some phenomenon or some experience or some reality can change and be reshaped as we bring more insight, more information. I mean, it's the essence of the scientific method, after all, that Einstein said no experiment will ever prove me right. A single experiment can always prove me wrong. So that sense that knowledge is evolving. So I should probably be careful about that particular phraseology, because it sounds, I once had a very unpleasant meeting with, with a faculty member. We were talking about the tenure decision, and her department had really botched it and had done a very poor job of all of the kind of process that needs to surround a difficult tenure decision. And I said to her, you know, you need to do the work and bring us the truth. And she said, President Walsh, I don't believe in truth. So I hear where you're coming from. And that wasn't what I intended. Interesting question. So, yeah, Joe and I had a nice conversation about that over dinner, and he's really smart on this topic. You should engage him. And my knowledge of it is just in this one sector of higher education where I've been hanging out, which is this kind of highly selective, high profile sector. And, you know, there's so much wisdom and knowledge and insight and experience about online learning in community colleges and so many other sectors of the U.S. education system that is extremely diverse. But this, you're asking a different question, which is sort of what is the social impact? I think, one of the things people are talking about and hoping to see evolve is that some of these tools, the Web 2.0, the social media, all of the ways in which you can create kind of communities, conversation groups and so on online, can be valuable and can be a way of kind of disseminating out from institutions that have the resources to bring people on campus for a very intense interpersonal connection, a kind of simulacrum of that, but never a substitute for that in terms of, I think, the value of it or the importance of it. I mean, we all know sitting in a room with other people, breathing the same air, seeing facial expressions, hearing the timbre of a voice, seeing, a body, all of it, even if you can capture that on a screen with glass between you and the person, isn't ever going to be the same as the lived reality of it. And so it's hard to tell where there are all kinds of conversations about it, where are we now? Is this sudden fascination with these massive courses and trying to use these online tools more and more effectively to solve some of the problems in higher education, the costs and other things. But my personal belief is there will always be some, enormous need and great value for that in-person encounter of these differences and different viewpoints and different ideas and different experiences in the way I talked about it. And the worry is, of course, that because of the cost pressures, that will become something that's available for those who can afford it, and others who can't afford it will be relegated to this other online version that will be certainly a less powerful learning opportunity. Well, I mean, sort of wise guy, simple answers by listening really carefully, by listening really well, by making sure that when in any kind of decision-making group or a group in authority or administrative group that you have people who are able to connect with the variety of voices, and that's not always easy because multiplicity, is growing rapidly. So these kind of structural things, and I think just honoring and respecting and going back and listening again, and so it takes time to do that. So for this particular clash I told you about, which was right in the beginning of my presidency, which I was so high profile and perceived to be such a potential risk to the college's reputation, and that we first handled it by creating really serious boundaries around it and making some decisive moves and getting the word out to all the alumni about how we were handling this, and we did all of that and carefully and I think effectively, and the faculty mobilized and began sort of making decisions about how they would basically censure but not censor the person whose work the classicist was critiquing. And so making sure we stood up for the principle of freedom of speech and academic freedom first, and then after that we made very clear what it was about the speech that was objectionable and unacceptable. So that whole process. But then the thing that I noticed and learned from that was then I went and talked to student groups. And I remember a very painful, this is in my second year on the job, a very painful meeting with the African American student group, and saying, you know, you've written this statement out to the alumni, and you've said that these values are not our values, and who said you get to say what our values are, and why didn't you ask us, and why didn't you come to us, and we admire this man, and he's the one who pays attention to us. So listening to that, understanding that I had to do what I did and that it was the right thing to do, but trying to get under that to something deeper. So what is going on here, and what is missing here for them, and how can we draw them in a different way, these student leaders in this particular group, and make sure that in our effort to manage this big public issue, we also are working very hard to understand what over here we trampled on a little bit, and maybe we had to, but we're not going to walk away from that. We're going to come back and come back and come back until we can understand what we can do about the wound that we opened up over here. And so it's things like that, I think. So clearly it's up to faculty, right? And so I think the work that has been done out in the greater Amherst area, to create opportunities for faculty to come together to support. There's this Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, and then Association for Contemplative Practice in Higher Education. So bringing faculty together, it's almost what the Dalai Lama did in India, right? It's sort of finding the champions, finding the people who are doing this in their own classes and in their own programs, bringing them together, giving them opportunities to exchange with and learn from each other, sort of building a community of practice, right, that can continue to advance the work, and that provides both some protective cover for everybody, right, because it is in some ways countercultural, but also a new language that people can use and bring to it, a sort of practice. So in the safety of this smaller group of people who are doing the work, learning how to talk about it in a way that you can take it out to groups that are less familiar and feel, and in a way that's comfortable and acceptable. And then, different kinds of career opportunities and career paths begin to open up. So I think if the sort of building these professional societies and seeing them take root and grow, and then younger faculty who would love to be part of this, but think it might be a career killer, get a chance to go somewhere and see, oh my gosh, these are tenured, successful faculty members, and they're doing this. And so I think that's a strategy. It's to kind of build that capacity into the academy. And I think it's happening. Yeah, at Wellesley, it has been. So I've been gone 6 years. There's when I arrived, the year before I arrived, Nan Cohan, who had been my predecessor, who went off to Duke when I came to Wellesley, had a chaplain who'd been there for many years, and been very popular and wonderful, but she had decided to retire. And so the question arose, we have this campus at Wellesley had never been attached to any denomination, but it was clearly a Christian tradition, and with this big chapel in the middle shaped like a cross. And we have a student body that's just more and more diverse. There are so many faith traditions and so students from all over the world, and it's only going to increase. And so what's a chaplaincy program in a situation like that? What does it look like? And so Peter Gomes at that point was on the board of trustees at Wellesley, and so Nan wisely asked him to lead a group, a small committee with faculty and others, and they found this really interesting man, Victor Kazanchian, who had a vision of a multi-faith chaplaincy that would so that the chaplain would not represent any faith tradition. He would be the chaplain for the entire college, and he would speak at all the important, college-wide events, but never bring a single perspective of a single faith tradition. And then there would be part-time chaplaincies. We had 13 different faith traditions represented, and there were just little bits of time, and it wasn't terribly expensive because and then there was a student multi-faith council, and they were doing wonderful work. And one of the things we discovered with them was that they came to college, many of them without, deeply rooted kind of understanding of their own particular faith tradition, and they'd come to college and people would ask them about it, and so they'd go deeper into their own beliefs and their own traditions in order to be able to engage with others from other traditions. So it was both a chance to learn more about who I am and where I've come from and what my beliefs are, and then also to engage someone else whose beliefs might be very different. Anyway, so there were a number of programs developed around that, and they've continued. There was this conference that Wellesley held, I think in my second or third year, that really seeded a whole field. There were probably a dozen books that came out of it, and there are other, not that we were, the only ones who invented this, but a whole field of this kind of multi-faith approach emerged. And then the thing that has happened at Wellesley since I left was the same person was then put in charge of multicultural education too. So he's now he's holding both of those, and there are tremendously interesting cross-fertilization between these two areas. So it continues to grow and develop. So it has been sustainable. The alums, at first, there was real concern that some of the alums would feel that it was a terrible loss. They remembered chapel, they remembered choir, they remembered, how important it was. And gradually they came on board, and they've been tremendously supportive of it. We raised $10 million in our campaign to transform part of the chapel into a multi-faith center. So it was, and there were a lot of conversations that led to that, clearly, where people had to kind of let go of something they were holding on to pretty tightly in terms of a memory. But yeah, I think it's rooted deeply. I think it's sustainable. I also think sustainability is really, and there's some really interesting people, by the way, doing work on mindfulness and sustainability, mindfulness and climate change. Because if you think about it, it's hard to think of another problem that's as terrifying in some ways as the idea that we've already passed some point of no return in terms of climate change. And if we have, what kind of abyss are we staring into? And I don't know how we look at that without bringing some sort of protective circle around it of people who are really committed to supporting each other and bringing their kind of deepest sense of interpersonal connection into thinking about those problems. And there are people who are doing wonderful work on that too. But you didn't ask that. So I didn't have them. We weren't all sitting around meditating at all. So part of what I think I tried to say is, we were mindful. We were mindful because of because of the commitment we made to be learning, right? And to not kid ourselves about things, and to be honest, and to be real with each other. Right? And to engage if there was a rupture and which as often happens, when you're trying to lead a change process, one of the things that happens first, the system, to reify the system, but is they say two people or a team coming at them, this thing called the system, right? The first thing to do is drive a wedge between them, divide them, because then that diminishes their power and maybe you can make them go away. So there are all kinds of ways in which when you're trying to work together as a team or as partners, leading this change process, all of a sudden you're hearing weird things about your partner, right? Something, and you have to come back and sort it out and no blame and shame, but just try to understand and then make some agreements about how you're going to deal with that. So we were doing a lot of that. So it wasn't, so that was that's sort of what I'm meaning by mindfulness. And so it's not that we were, and I mentioned all these Buddhists that came to the campus that kind of got my attention. And so, but even my own contemplative practice was kind of a combination of different things that were working for me at a given time. I ran out around the lake every day. I counted that. I mean, that counts, right? And whatever. So it, but I think it works. I mean, I think it's real. And so, and learning from the disciplines of contemplative practice and learning what a serious discipline is and learning what the elements of that are, in different ways. I think we're part of it. There's no question that the senior staff experienced our team as something unusual. There's sort of a diaspora now. Lots of them have stayed with my successor, who's terrific, but the ones who've gone other places will often say to me, wow, we were really doing something different. I don't think I'll ever find this again in my career. And it was special. So and that was the kind of the mindful leadership that we were engaged in. Well, yeah, I mean, John Kabat-Zinn is constantly, and others are being invited into the corporate sector. And, I think there's a book by, oh gosh, I'm not going to be able to summon his name. This is, a U.S. congressman. Thank you. Tim Ryan has written a book called A Mindful Nation. He's kind of pulled that picture together in so many sectors, and not right in the heart of it, but more and more kind of growing up from in different spaces in I think almost every sector. Certainly in medicine, there are people working on this. So I think it's in a lot of different places, and because it's so obviously needed. I mean, this craziness that we say to ourselves every day, this is so crazy, and my life is out of control. Somebody said the other day, I'm spending, I forget how many hours she said, I'm spending 3 hours, 4 hours a day sitting at this, looking into this computer screen. This is a job I didn't even apply for. It's running my life. I don't want to be driven by this machine all the time anymore. I don't know how to disengage from it. There are wonderful things about it, but I have friends who have on the weekends they declare it dark screen time. They shut down all the screens on the weekends. No screens are allowed to be on, and people are trying to regulate what their kids are doing, and so we all feel really worried about. There's a book called The Shallows. I forget his name. But, thank you. Say it again. Nick Carr, thank you. Nick Carr, I've got it on my Kindle. It's hard to remember the names of authors on the Kindle because somehow. Nick Carr, it's a wonderful book, beautifully written about what these internet, the connection to the internet is actually doing to the shape of our minds and the way we think. So I think we both see it as a wonderfully valuable and amazing tool. It's done, it's radically changed our lives, but also is something that we want to choose how we use it and not have it in control of us to the same degree that it is. And I think, contemplative practice, mindfulness, just every day getting up in the morning and spending a little time reconnecting with yourself instead of going right onto your computer. I mean, that in itself is a radical act. And I find when I meditate and I'm there meditating. Of course, the first thing you're trying to kind of settle in and not have these ideas that in this monkey mind getting in your way, or at least to notice what's happening. And what I notice happening so often is something on my internet. It's something, an email I got or an email I'm sending, composing in my mind, or, it's taken over even that, I mean, the sort of the busy monkey mind is taken over by the technology too. So I think everybody feels that we have to come to some different understanding of all of that. It's Jerry Turkle who wrote the book that was so pro-technology and then wrote the one that was a lot of concern. So it's out there. I think we're out of time. I thank you very much for, yeah.